All right, so why don't we start by you sharing a little bit about yourself, your role at a Riviera Presbyterian Church, and accomplishments that you're proud of.
Sure. So I am an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church. I've been working in ministry for almost 10 years. This is my third call, my third church that I've been a pastor to. Right now at Riviera, my role is as transitional pastor, which means that I've come in after a pastor who has been there for a long time, and I'm sort of shepherding the congregation through this season of transition and could potentially end up being like in a more permanent role here, or the practice is that you may go on to be in a permanent role at another church somewhere else. So we're sort of navigating that discernment right now together as a congregation, which is really exciting. And I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of most proud of in the work that I'm doing right now, is sort of jumping in with this congregation and taking a look back at where they've come from so far, and also helping them to envision what is next for their future.
So, what does being a woman mean for you?
So, being a woman means for me being a part of the human family, also being strong and courageous, having to navigate a lot of difficult spaces, especially in our culture. But I think most importantly, for my work and for my ministry, being a woman means being made in the image of God.
So, what specific challenges or stereotypes from society or others regarding being a woman have you experienced in your life?
Well, certainly as a minister, even though for decades now, especially in our denomination, they've been ordaining women to the ministry, people are still shocked and confused when they see a woman minister out in the world, especially if you're wearing like a clergy collar. In fact, yesterday I was out at the grocery store and I was just doing my regular shopping, and a stranger came up to me and was like, are you a priest? I was like, well, I'm a pastor, but I'm a Protestant pastor. Because she was like, oh yeah, I did not get the memo that they were ordaining women to the priesthood. And so you find yourself having to like explain yourself to people a lot when they see you in an official capacity as a pastor, because there's still very much a strong stereotype of like, men are ministers, preachers, pastors in congregations. And, there's a strong sense of what a pastor's wife role is, but there's not such a strong sense of like what a woman as a minister is in the church still, even after decades. So that's probably the biggest place where I've bumped up against stereotypes in my work. But also in my life before ministry, working in organizations where it was like all female leadership, and people would be like, oh, so you're the director, you're the CEO, you're the this, you're the that. And they were pretty surprised a lot of the time to see like an entire leadership structure that was all female.
Does that, how does that show up for you on a regular basis in front of your congregation? Have you faced backlash or any, pushback about you being?
Luckily, not so much at this congregation. Okay. Thanks be to God, this is a community here at Riviera that has had a long history of having women in leadership. I think I'm the third pastor in a row that they've had that was a woman. So they are very comfortable with seeing women in that role and having women in leadership across the board. I think even in our governing body right now, of the 9 elders that we have like making the decisions for our congregation, 1 is a man, maybe 2 are men, yeah. But in previous churches, I've bumped up against some pretty strong pushback, both around my gender and my race, and even my age to some degree. Even though I'm a woman now in my 40s, people still have this sense, I think also because I'm a woman and because I'm a person of color, that you seem really young to be a pastor. That's what I get a lot. And I'm like, well, how old do you have to be? Jesus was 33 when he started his ministry. So, yeah.
How has your faith and your social identities informed your approaches to pastoral care and social justice?
So I think So I grew up in a very small town, and I'm a child of immigrants. So I was living in this rural community in Central Florida, a child of Caribbean immigrants from Jamaica. And so I felt a lot of my growing up years like an outsider, like a person who was longing for a place where they felt like they belonged. And I think that that experience, more than any other, has really helped to shape the way that I view ministry, the way I view community too, as a place. If ever there were a place where people should feel at home and like they belong no matter who they are, I think the church should be that place. Communities of faith more broadly, of all kinds of traditions, should be that place where people should feel like they can be at home as they are, whoever they are, and whatever their background is. And that's a theology that I've taken with me through my ministry, wherever context I've been in. And I think that that also informs my pastoral care and the ways that I interact with my parishioners, because I like to try as best I can in every situation to make people feel at home and not however they've been treated by other groups or faith groups or churches, that they know that they can find a home here with us, and at least with me, I will never, exclude them.
I love that. That's not something that you see that often
Unfortunately.
in church communities.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that is unique about the community at Riviera is they are sort of built around that idea of, if you have felt abandoned or if you have felt excluded from communities of faith in the past, this is a place where you can find healing and refuge from that, and hopefully learn to do church in a different way than you were taught in your youth.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, thanks. It is.
What are the threats you see for young women, girls, and people on the gender margins that are most concerning to you?
I think one of the things recently that has really felt like pretty concerning is the ways in which it feels like, especially now, we're teaching women, girls, and also, people of varying marginalized genders not to trust their own bodies, not to trust their own stories, not to trust their own realities, because we, as a culture, not all of us, but our culture has kind of minimized and forced a lot of people on the edges to feel as though the things that they see, experience, hear, the ways that they're treated are invalid, are not actually what's happening. There's a lot of gaslighting that goes on in our culture, and a lot of ways in which we are taught to not trust the reality of our own experience and our own senses sometimes. No, whatever that person did to you, that didn't really happen. No, you aren't really experiencing trauma, all of these things. And I think that one of the greatest gifts that we can give to our young people and to people who are coming up, whether they're discovering who they are and exploring their identity, or whether they are strong in their sense of who they are already, is to listen to that, trust that, and learn from them instead of feeling like we have something that we need to teach them to correct whatever truth or knowledge they have about themselves. Yeah.
Can you think of an example of an experience that you've had in terms of that, gaslighting, or that kind of idea of feeling invalid, or what you're experiencing is not true?
Yeah. So I recently had an interaction with a young adult in the church that they were struggling with a lot of anxiety because they were experiencing this sort of, I don't know if you would call it bullying or just some antagonism from some people in their own family as they were going through a pretty anxious period of self-discovery. And they kept saying, I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know who to believe. I don't even know if if God is real, because how could God have made me this way and like forced me into this situation where I am experiencing so much suffering. And it's really hard when you are faced with a person who's in that situation to be like, oh, no, God is totally real. You want to validate what they're saying, but you also want to give them some sort of hope.
Yeah.
So I tried my best to strike a balance of like, I hear you. This is really hard. I can't imagine what it's like to live in a place where, you're feeling invalidated all the time. And also, I believe that God lives right with us in the midst of our suffering and is right there present with us. And don't give up hope, I guess, that eventually God will help you to make a way through and to find your way to like the other side of that, where you can feel comfortable in your own skin again. Yeah. And also just offering some kind of like support, like if you need me, I'm here kind of stuff.
That's great.
Yeah. But it's still pretty hard,
Yeah.
encountering things like that.
I mean, being that person where someone, people in your community at least know that if they're feeling invalidated or if they're feeling gaslit, that they can, that they won't get that from you. I feel like it's a powerful,
yeah, exactly.
It's a powerful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I know what that experience is of having somebody say to you, what you see and feel is not real. And I would never want that for anybody else. And so
Right.
I try to be that person as best I can. None of us are perfect, but,
Right.
it's always a work in progress.
And it's a societal gaslighting as well. I mean,
Yes.
It's hard to escape when the messaging you're hearing, particularly the first thing that came to my mind was sexual assault. And when the media is, telling women all the time that it's not true or what happened to them is not valid or real, you internalize those messages. And
yeah. It's so true. I have 2 young daughters, and both of them, we've had lots of open conversations about like our bodies, being girls and women, and that sort of thing. And the one thing that I always tell them is, trust your own instincts, trust that inner voice inside of you, because that is, like the spirit of the divine that is speaking within you, and don't ever let anybody force you into disbelieving or mistrusting that. I feel like we are often trained out of that by the time we become adults.
Right.
And kind of second guessing ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just empowerment and belief and
self-belief. Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any personal experiences or experiences as a minister around young girls and women experiencing self-harm that you would be willing to share?
Yeah. So early in my ministry years, I worked in a community where many of the women and girls, it was exclusively with women and girls, and many of them had been through some degree of trauma. So either they'd been part of the sex trafficking trade, victims of sex trafficking, refugees, had some kind of abuse or addiction in their past and were in recovery. And so we had lots of people in our community who had either been living with eating disorders, cutting, that kind of self-harm, and trying to self-medicate with harmful things like drug use and alcohol use and sex and things like that are, when used out of balance, could cause people to have pretty devastating consequences to their mental and physical health. Just like I was saying with the person who was having this anxiety experience, learning how to see yourself as holy, as a child of God, was a big part of the healing process for a lot of those women. And I think it was interesting because in that particular community, there was a strong connection to and like a gravitation toward the divine feminine. So a lot of traditions, especially in the West, kind of focus on God as Father. And that's a very powerful image for a lot of people, but also it can be a very scary and daunting and damaging image for people who have been victimized by their own fathers or by father figures or men in their lives.
Right.
And so it was a really beautiful and healing experience to watch this group, this community of women sort of coalesce around ritual and sacred experience that centered femininity and the sacred feminine across cultural traditions. So we drew from a lot of indigenous and a lot of pre-Christian and a lot of, I guess indigenous and pre-Christian were the main ones, traditions to sort of reclaim a kind of spirituality that could be helpful and transformative for them.
It's cool how it feels like femininity was initially the issue, what brought them down, but also can be the thing that can bring them out of that
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Depending
it's like
on the way they're framing it or understanding it.
Right. It was like a full circle moment for a lot of them, taking this thing that had been seen as less than and broken and weak within them and allowing it to become their center and core of their power. Yeah.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. So what does strength and resilience look like for you in your life?
It looks like recognizing when things are too much and asking for help. It also looks like taking deep breaths and starting again some days when things get to be overwhelming. And I think it also looks like loving people, even when they're hard to love, which is a lot of the work that we have to do as pastors, as parents, as people these days.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful description, a definition of those terms that I think are often seen in very different and more potentially harmful ways.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember that strength can also be flexibility. It's not always about like brute strength.
Yeah.
It's also about being able to bend and stretch and adapt.
And self-care, self-love.
Yeah, all of those are strong things that are underrated.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Great. Who are some role models that you've looked up to throughout your life?
Oh, well, the immediate first ones that come to my mind are I was raised in my household by my mother and my grandmother, and my aunt, my mother's sister, lived just a couple of blocks away. So when I was a kid, I used to jokingly call those three women the tribunal, because whenever I would get into trouble or whenever anything was happening in my life, it would be like the three of them down on me like harpies, you know? But as I've gotten older, I've come to think of them as the holy trinity of mothers that I have in my life. My grandmother has passed away, but my mom and my aunt are still alive and kicking and very much both playing like that dual mother role in my life. So those three for sure. And then growing up, I had my very first, like my home church, my very first pastor that I had as a kid that I remember was a young woman. She was the first woman I ever saw as a pastor. And she was the person who really started me on the path towards wanting to explore ministry as a goal, as a vocation. And her name is Michelle Thomas Bush. She's a pastor in North Carolina now, in Charlotte. And she's definitely one of my greatest mentors to this day.
So what qualities from either your relatives or Michelle did you look up to or aspire to have that were inspirational to you?
Oh man, I think for sure there, at least with my tribunal, with the women in my family, it was their strength, like strength of spirit, strength of body. My grandmother's saying that she would always, repeat is, I will find a way or I will make it. So even if you can't find a way, you're going to create your own way. And I feel like that is the way of, especially, women of color, immigrant women, in this world, is we have to find our own way of doing things. And for Michelle, I think it was her openness. I mean, she was the person when I was a kid growing up who in a church context in the Bible Belt was, teaching little kids in middle school, being a queer person, being a homosexual, being gay, lesbian, whatever label you wanted to put on it, was just as much a part of who you are as the color of your eyes, the color of your hair. It's not something you can change. And not only that, it's the way God made you. And so that was something that was instilled in me from like very young, to the point where as I grew up, it never seemed strange. When other people around me, kids in my youth group or kids when I was in college or seminary, were having these like mind-blowing, faith-shattering experiences of like, what? God could create people like this in the image of God. I was like, yeah, obviously. I mean, isn't that what you guys were taught in church when you were kids? Wow. So I think that was the big thing from her that I got, was just this sense of like openness and inclusivity. Anyone, everyone is part of God's family.
Wow, that is such a special and unique experience in the church to have growing up.
Yeah.
And that perspective that it was surprising to hear the other things is not what most people, and especially in the LGBTQ community, I think, experience.
Right,
so,
right. Shout out to the Presbyterians.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so those were the big things. And then just also how to have lots of fun and make jokes out of everything. Yeah.
Do you feel that there are things that young boys, men, and masculine identified people are not taught about women or feminine people that are harmful?
Well, I mean, I think, as we kind of talked about a little bit before off camera, I think just the ways that we are taught about emotions and the ways to express them are probably one of the most damaging things that we're taught or not taught about each other, or like the other side or other gender identifications. Because I think that we are led to believe that there are certain traits or emotions that are inherently masculine, and there are certain traits and emotions that are inherently feminine. And then we are also taught, sort of layered on top of that, that there are certain traits and emotions that are good to express and certain ones that are not good to express. And so I think that the most damaging thing that we can do is teach our boys and men and masculine identifying people that like, you are only allowed to express this narrow bit of who you are as a creature and a child of God, and in this infinite capacity for emotion and, human experience. All you get to have is this little bit. And the same is true for women. All you get to have is this little bit, and you can't explore all these other infinite variations of what your humanity has inside of it. I think that if we could undo that, a lot of harm could be avoided for people of every gender.
So how do you see that potentially happening? What could that look like for you?
Man, well, I think that it comes down to finding a new way of talking about who we are as human creatures, and also finding a stronger sense of balance between like the world in which we live now, which feels very much dominated by this sense of like, you can only get ahead by using violence and aggression and this toxification of human emotion, where we say it's not okay to cry, it's not okay to be vulnerable, it's not okay to be affectionate to people. It's always about competition. It's always about, crushing your opponent sort of things. If we could find a way to unlock within us, whether we are masculine identifying or whether we are feminine identifying, a greater range of our human selves, and the greater range of our human emotion, and allowing that to be okay in all kinds of public spaces, not just behind closed doors, not just when we're alone, but when we are in relationship and in community with people. I feel like that's the key to opening up a different kind of vision for our future, one in which humankind can work in partnership with each other more than they are working in competition with each other. And that's, I think, what we need to find our way to in order for us to survive. We can only make it into our future together, and only if we are able to be in a greater sense of partnership rather than competition with one another.
I think language also can play a big role in that shift, and the way that I appreciate your use of the word human and human creatures. It's like a leveling of the playing field, and just, grouping us all together into one category. I think is a powerful, first step.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of, trying to think of other examples, but just even the shifting of, our language around gender in general can help to remove some of those barriers, those boxes, definitions.
Yeah, I mean, the earliest ways of describing us as people was to call us like the being, the human, we as people, as humankind, we like to categorize things and like put them into boxes to help our brains make sense of them. But I don't think that is inherently how we were created to be, like you have to be this or you have to be that, and never the twain shall meet. I think that we live in an infinite world, in an infinite universe. If you are a person of faith, as I am, I believe that we, are created by an infinitely creative God, that because God is infinitely creative, we are infinite in our variations of expression of humanity. And so there is no one way to be woman, there is no one way to be man, there is no one way to be anything across the spectrum. It is all possible, and it is all holy, and it is all sacred. And I think that's what we need to get to, is an understanding of like that, just that expansiveness. God is infinite, and we can be too.